Hey y'all, Zach McDonald, your real estate agent with Real Property Associates, and this is my Seattle real estate market update for September 2025. What's up, everyone? We are just wrapping up the summer here in Seattle, and the summer selling season, the busy season, all the listings coming on the market is starting to wind down as the kids are going back to school. At least my kids are going back to school, and we're starting to think about, the holidays and such. Now, a lot of people think the summer is the hottest time of the year in the housing market, and in reality, I don't think it is. If we look at any of the graphs and the charts, really that spring is the hot time of the year when you start to see at least the competition's the most fierce. You have this kind of sweet spot of the amount of listings on the market, and you have this sweet spot of the amount of buyers that are looking to purchase. As you get to the summer, there's usually quite a bit more people putting their houses on the market. So you do see more listings, specifically in July, a little less in August. It usually starts to slow down a tiny bit, but the amount of buyers doesn't continue to keep up with the amount of listings. At least it hasn't in the past few years. And so what we've seen in Seattle over the past couple years is a relatively competitive spring, even with the higher interest rates. But we've seen that the amount of housing inventory starts rising to a point when it gets a little bit slower. And so this year, it was a little bit more dramatic. I think we had the higher rates still. We're still hovering in that 7% range. Not a lot of hope, at least a couple months ago. Not a lot of hope about rates coming down yet, inflation being under control. At least we were starting to see some of those signs and starting to question, why are we still in the same spot with the Fed rate? But then it shifted here over the last month and a half. We've started to see job reports revised. We've seen signs that maybe we would see a Fed rate cut here soon. We've seen some of the inflation data being a little bit more positive, at least overall. Last month actually seemed a little bit higher than was expected. But I think there's a lot of hope in the housing market now, whereas even a few months ago, it seemed like this could start to go really negative if the trends continue in the same direction. And really what we started to see is the amount of houses on the market were getting to a point where there were a lot of price reductions, sometimes 2, 3 price reductions, depending on how aggressive the first one was. Houses were taking longer to sell, right? And so sellers, that's not a good feeling if you're selling your house. Everybody would like to get their asking price or a little bit more, right? Buyers, of course, love the housing market when it's transitioning like that or it's changing like that. So I had a client here recently, and I always share a client story before I really get into the stats. Great family. They raise their children in their house. They've owned it for almost 30 years. They bought a new house across the country and they sold their other one. It was amazing to get to walk through that. Obviously, lots and lots of just cool memories, right? Raising your family in the house in their case and then moving across the country. So just lots of different variables. They've updated the house twice, right, since they bought it. So a lot of the things that they did before, right? Different updates to a bathroom or the kitchen or the changes to the, cabinets. You start to see those things as styles change and things change. So beautifully updated house. And in their case, right, the market was a little bit slower and has been, still is, but it's starting to pick up. But in their case, we had a little bit longer time on the market, right? And then we did a couple different price reductions to the eventual sales price. And it really was finding the sweet spot in the market where the buyers were interested in buying. And their house was a higher price point in Everett, in the location they were in. So whenever you're in the higher price point, sometimes things just take a little bit longer to sell in general when you're far above the median. But just a good example of kind of how the market has been behaving most of the summer, but it's starting to change. So we talked about interest rates coming down a little bit. The mortgage rates were hovering around 7 most of the year. over the past few weeks, we've seen mortgage rates drop into the 6.25 range. And so Mortgage News Daily this week, I've seen 6.29, 6.28, 6.27. It's kind of been in that just right around 6.25 range. And Mortgage News Daily is, if you haven't heard of it, one of my favorite sources for the rates because they're surveying lots of the top companies across the country. And every single day they're putting out a report on some of the different loan types. I always reference the 30-year fix because it's the most common, but they've got a lot of the other common loan types and references to what those rates are every single day. So I think it's super helpful. And the mortgage rates change every day. They're not static. They're not like the Fed rate. The Fed rate is not the mortgage rate. So the mortgage rate, there's some influence, but it's not the same. It's not a direct correlation. And so you're seeing the mortgage rates changing every day, even with the Fed rate remaining consistent. And if you're looking at some of those changes, I think looking at the year over year numbers here for median sales price, we'll start there. In Seattle, $975 was the median sales price this last month in Seattle. It's up 5.4% year over year. And the King County number we were talking about was around like 2%, a little over 2%. So Seattle has been outpacing King County as a whole. I've shared in the past, over the past couple months specifically, I think that the thought of returning to work has started to bring some more people back to Seattle. We're still waiting to see that fully fleshed out, but Seattle has outperformed King County here over the past few months as a whole. Bellevue saw a median sales price decline year over year. Now, that has not been the case all year long, but it was for this month, $1,770,000. Now, for those that are less familiar with the area, it's pretty typical to see Bellevue's median sales price about double to the Seattle median sales price. In both cases, down month over month as well. I've shared regularly that the month over month price stat is tough because there's a seasonality to the housing market. And I think that the year over year tends to be a little bit better metric. As we're looking at the average percent of the list price. So thinking about, okay, what's the pricing look like? What are the houses going to sell for, right? If you're a buyer, you're probably curious about what you're going to end up paying. Sellers, hey, what am I going to get? So in Seattle, it was right at asking price. So the average percent of list price, right at asking price. Bellevue was 99.1% of the list price on average. The one stat I think is a little better, and I always share both because it gives you that contrast. The median percentage of the original list price is even better here, I think. You get 98.9%. So that factors in some price reductions in Seattle and 97.2% in Bellevue. So we're seeing that number is a little bit different because of, again, we're factoring in price reductions, and we're seeing a lot more of those in our market right now than we were seeing maybe a few years back. Those numbers were pretty much the same. There was no need to talk about it. Now, time on market has been increasing just a little bit here in this. I didn't change too much over the summer in Seattle and Bellevue. Now, in other parts of King County, it did, and Snohomish County as well. If we're looking a little bit on the north end, the median days on market, 12 in Seattle across the board and 10 in Bellevue. So pretty small days on market time. The average a little bit higher, but still not super high. For Seattle, 27 days on market for the average. Bellevue was 23 days on market. So that number, again, higher, but not dramatically different. There usually is some parity between those two numbers. The average is taking and weighting the higher days on market homes a little bit heavier. And the median, I think, is cutting those out, which is nice. It gives a little bit better picture, I think, of what's happening. But there are quite a few houses that are sitting on the market still in Seattle and Bellevue. So looking at the new listings, we're seeing 680 new listings in Seattle, 128 in Bellevue. And those numbers are both up year over year. It's been the trend all year long. And we're seeing the amount of pending sales picking up, or at least trying to keep up with the amount of new listings. It was not happening earlier in the spring and in the summer. We were seeing a lot more houses coming on the market than selling, which is why we started to see the amount of housing inventory increasing. And in some cases, as we talked about, in a more, I don't know if I would say scary way, but at least a way that we were starting to say, hey, what's going on? Like, the market's slowing down. And I've heard, and this is interesting, multiple different people, whether it's a buyer making an offer or somebody I was talking with, like, the market's like really slowing down right now, isn't it? And that might have been the news a few months ago, but it started to level off a little bit. And that's some of the signs that we're seeing here. We saw more pending sales in Seattle than we did in Bellevue, quite a bit more. We always do. But we did see quite a bit fewer listings, and that was a huge help because there were so many listings, the buyers just weren't able to keep up. And over the last month in Seattle, we did see fewer pending sales than we did last month, but it was a lot closer to the amount of listings that were coming on the market. And that brings us to the stat that we usually wrap up with here in these updates, and that is the supply numbers. So how many houses are available on the market for the amount of buyers? And we've been seeing over the last few months that this number has been climbing relatively dramatically. And if we look back at the beginning of the year, we started December, we wrapped up December, 1.1 month of supply in Seattle and 0.6 months of supply in Bellevue. This would be a really competitive market starting the year. And that's how the year started off. But very quickly, these numbers started increasing. And by the time we got to May, we were at 2.8 months of supply in Seattle and 3.1 months of supply in Bellevue. And these numbers have remained relatively consistent up and down throughout the summer. But now we find ourselves a little bit on the lower end there, 2.5 months of supply in Seattle and 2.7 months of supply in Bellevue. And I think the big question is, what does this all mean, right? There's lots of data, information. For me, as I'm looking at this, I always categorize it in a pretty basic way. I mean, we're looking at how much opportunity there is for buyers to choose something else, right? When you're looking at this number, and the more there are options, the fewer buyers are going to compete over the same ones. And the less likely they are to pay more for the same ones. They're going to be able to choose something different and maybe let that one sit a little bit, maybe go buy that one instead. And, maybe somebody else will come back to this one, but it'll have been taking some time and that seller wants to sell it. And that buyer says, well, I'm not going to pay you your asking price anymore. So you start to see a little bit of negotiation. And so the more we have available, the more negotiation there is, the more time on the market, the longer it takes to sell. And usually then the lower the prices are. And so over the last few months, we've been seeing the opposite trend, right? We've seen more inventory rising. We've seen the amount of asking price decreasing. I mean, earlier in the year, we were seeing on average houses selling over asking price. So back in March, Seattle, 3% over asking price. Bellevue, 5% over asking price. And that would have been about the peak of the year, really. But now we're seeing, as we talked about earlier, houses getting about asking price, 99.9% in Seattle and 99.1% in Bellevue. But again, the true number, right? The true number is that percent of the original listing price. And the true numbers here, back in March, 2.7% over asking price and 4.6% over asking price in Bellevue. So almost the same as the original list price because there weren't a lot of price reductions. But when you start to factor those in, it's a bigger gap, 98.5 and 97.8. So you're seeing 4 to 6% drop in the difference in the asking price amount. So again, earlier in the spring, more competitive market, lower inventory. Now we're starting to see things leveling off. So we're not seeing it continue to go down, right? We're not continuing to see that percentage go down, but it's not going up quite yet. Now, I think that's coming. I think if interest rates continue to trend down and we start to see fewer listings coming on the market, which we normally do this time of year, I think we're looking towards a more competitive winter housing market beginning of the spring, and maybe even more competitive than we've seen in quite some time. Thanks so much for watching this month's Seattle real estate market update. And that means you made it all the way to the end if you're still watching this video. So if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do it. And if there's any way that I can bring value to your situation, whether you're thinking about buying or selling or even investing in a property here in the Seattle area, I'd love to be a resource.